Romans chapter 3, verses 1 through 4, Paul begins a series of anticipatory questions and answers with regard to the response to what he's just said. Just by way of reminder, chapter 1, after the opening pleasantries in the first 11 or so verses, plus his statements about his readiness to preach the gospel in verses 14 through 17, begins basically an excoriation of the Gentile world, beginning in verse 18 through verse 32. That the Gentiles should have had a knowledge of God, but they suppressed the knowledge of God. That they should have, first of all, known from their from a common morality that there was a God, and they should have known by looking at nature that there was a God. And they suppressed the knowledge of God, Paul says. And thus, when you get to verse 24 through 27, you find a scathing indictment of the Gentile world in their practice of homosexuality. Then you get to verses 28 through 32, and a litany of sins, many of them of gross immorality, that marked the Gentile world because of their suppression of the knowledge of God. Then chapter 2, Paul begins, he turns his attention to the Jews and begins he really hammers the Jews as people who had been given the law of God, and yet they also were unfaithful. The Gentiles were unfaithful because they suppressed the natural knowledge of God. The Jews were under condemnation because they'd been given a specific revelation from God, but they hadn't done anything with it. And thus found themselves essentially in the same boat. The Gentiles suppressed the knowledge of God. They were all lost in sin. The Jews had received the knowledge of the will of God in written form, and yet they failed God, and they were under condemnation of sin. And then we get to chapter 3, and Paul begins to anticipate objections that some of the Jews may offer up. And in chapter 3, verse 1, the objection is, then what advantage does the Jew have? What is the profit of circumcision? And basically saying, what was so great about being a Jew? If we're in the same boat as the Gentiles, what's so great about being a Jew? And Paul says, much in every way. For unto the Jews were committed the oracles or the sayings of God. And so what Paul is drawing out here is that even though you ended up under the same condemnation of sin, you have enjoyed a relationship with God, a knowledge of God, and a relationship with God that nobody in the Gentile world ever had. And that knowledge and that relationship blessed your life, or it should have. In other words, you ought to be able to look back all the way from the time of Abraham back to 2,000 years, all the way up to about 400 years ago when the law was given. That's the reference to the oracles of God. The law was about 430 to 475 years before Christ, somewhere in there. And so the law had only been given to the Jews for about 400 or so years. The promise to the law was... Anyway, the Jews had a long-standing history with God and an intimate knowledge of God.
They didn't place any value or appreciation with the relationship.
Right. What they're doing is they're asking, so what's the point in being a Jew if we're all in the same boat? Acting as if the last 2,000 years didn't mean anything, as it should.
God's chosen people didn't mean anything.
Yeah. What is it? What was the point of being God's chosen people if we all end up in the same boat? And Paul's like, you need to look at it. You need to look at it from a different, out of a different eye. You need to look at it of the eye of God chose you, God loved you, God led you, God gave you His word, God blessed you, and so there was a huge advantage of being a Jew in that you got to know God on a level that no Gentile ever got to know God. So then, and then in verses 3 and 4, Paul deals with the issue of the problem of the Gentile thinking. And that problem is this, that if the Jews ever fell into a state of captivity or disrepair, so to speak, the Gentile world would have immediately associated Jewish problems with the failure of God, because that's how Gentiles thought. In other words, if John's the king of a kingdom and I'm the king of a kingdom, and John decides he's going to gather up his army and he's going to come fight me and he conquers me, what's the Gentile world say? Oh, John's God is stronger than Todd's God. But if John comes after me to fight me and my army wins, then what are they going to say? Oh, well, Todd's God's certainly stronger than John's God, because Todd won and John lost. And that's the way the Gentile world looked at everything. But that wasn't right in regard to the Jews. But every time the Jews would fall into a state of captivity or would be punished by God, the Gentile world's thinking, well, that Israelite God, he's not very powerful, because if he is powerful, he wouldn't let that happen to his people. Notwithstanding the fact that God told him that was exactly what was going to happen. I mean, from the time God chose those people, what did he say? You do what I tell you, I'll pour out more blessings and you'll know what to do with. Your women will bear children, your livestock will bear, your crops will produce massive amounts of harvest. None of your enemies will be able to stand before you. Nobody can attack you. You'll have it made like nobody else in the world as long as you do what I say. But the moment you don't do what I say, she's fixing to get sideways. It's going to be bad for you. So God had already promised these things to his people, that when they disobeyed, things were going to get bad for them. The Gentile world didn't understand that. They just thought it was a failure of God. And by the way, and I may have mentioned this last week, but you recall in Exodus, when God got fed up with the Jews and he said to Moses, he said, I'm going to kill all of them and I'm going to start over with you and build a great nation, and I'm going to build it on you. You're going to be the foundation of a brand new nation greater than this one, and I'm fixing to kill all of them. And what did Moses say? He says, oh man, don't do that. Don't do that. And here's why. Because if you do that, all these Gentile people in the land of Canaan are going to say, the God of the Israelites was more powerful than the God of the Egyptians, because he brought them out from Egyptian captivity. But he wasn't powerful enough to bring them into the promised land, and so rather than being embarrassed by his lack of strength, he just killed them all. That was Moses' statement to God. And he's like, and that wouldn't be right, and I don't want people to think that way about you. So when you get to verses 3 and 4, it says, if some did not believe, does that make the promise of God of none effect? Certainly not. In other words, just because God didn't continually bless his people doesn't mean that his word's no good. What it actually proves is just the opposite. His word is good. And that's what the statement is, let God be true and every man a liar. Now look, when the Gentile world said that the God of Israel wasn't strong as, say, the gods of the people that were conquering them, it wasn't that they were lying. They were just saying something that was false. In other words, the concept is not that they're lying in the attempt to mislead people. It's just that what they're saying what they were saying is not true. But it's kind of categorized here as truth versus a lie. And that's why when it says, let God be true. And God is true. He blessed his people. He punished his people, just like he said. And anybody that said anything against it, when the people were on the downside, were not speaking the truth. So there's the first half of verse 4. And then the last half of verse 4 is that you may be justified when you speak and overcome when you are judged. And we closed out here last week with this, that whatever God says is right. Whatever God says is right. When God spoke to Samuel and told Samuel that Eli and his household were sorry, he was sorry because he didn't restrain his sons, and his sons were sorry because they were a bunch of fornicators and thieves. Samuel didn't want to tell Eli that. He was just a kid. Can you imagine a kid going to the man that raised you and telling him, hey, here's what God told me last night. You and your kids are sorry. You're sorry for not raising them right, and they're sorry just on face value. And I'm gonna bring calamity on you. God's gonna bring calamity on your house. But what did Eli say in response to that? It's the word of the Lord, therefore it's good. He didn't contest with God. He didn't contest with young Samuel. He said, if the Lord said it, it's good. It's right. And that's right. Whatever God says is good. It's right every single time. So no matter what God says, He's always justified in saying it. On the other half of that is, that you will overcome when you are judged, is that anytime somebody wants to hold God up to a particular standard, God's going to win. In other words, you want to bring God into a court of law and cross-examine Him? Good luck with that. Because anytime somebody puts God to any type of test like that, God always comes out on top. And He's always going to come out on top. You know, the Jews, let's just kind of go back, let's go back to Ezekiel 18, where God says, if a man does wickedness all of his life, and at the end of his life, he turns around and does what's right, God says all the wickedness that he has done will not be remembered. He's good to go. If a man does good all of his life, and at the end of his life quits doing good and starts doing evil, all the good that he's done will not be remembered. And what did Ezekiel say the Jews hollered? The way of the Lord is not fair. The way of the Lord is not fair. Now, who were they to determine what God was doing was fair or not? What about the parable of the laborers? One thing we miss in the parable. Well, there's a number of things we miss in the parable of the laborers. All right, but in the parable of the laborers in Matthew chapter 20, the landowner goes out the first hour of the day. Okay. And he says, go and work in my field, and I think it's called a penny. I think it says a penny, whatever. But they said, go and work in my fields today, and when you get done, I'll give you a penny. All right? In other words, a day's wage. You go work for me for a day, I'll give you a day's wage. They agreed. In other words, the conditions and the reward were agreed upon. We'll go work for this amount of money. If you'll notice, in all the other times when the master went back to the market and found people standing around, he said, go and work in my field, and whatever is right, I'll give you. Whatever is right. Now that's not a handshake deal hardly, is it? Like the first one, is it? Whatever is right. That kind of leaves it open, right? But they trusted. They trusted the landowner, so they went and worked. And so then what happened? End of the day comes, and he starts paying them, and he starts with the people that he only hired an hour ago. And he paid them a day's wages. And the next group came in that had only worked 4 hours, and he paid them a day's wages. And then only people that worked 6 hours, and he paid them a day's wages. And then the last group came in, after seeing the man doling out the money to everybody else, it says, they thought they would have received more. And when he gave them exactly what they all agreed to receive at the start of the day, they grumbled. What were they saying? The way of the Lord is not fair. You've made them our equals. They've only worked 1 hour. We've borne the heat of the day. This is not fair. And what did the master say? Friend, I have done you no wrong. I'm giving you exactly what I told you I'd give you, and you agreed to it. So was God fair or not? Is God free to do with His as He pleases or not? Sure He is. And so what I'm giving you this is when we try to hold God to man's standards and man's ideas, it's always a bad proposition for us. God says, my ways are higher than your ways. My thoughts are higher than your thoughts. Isaiah 55, 7 and 8. All right? As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. And so God's always right. In the judgment day, I think we may have talked about this at some point Sunday. There's 8 billion people on the planet right now, and there's probably that many that's ever lived. So if God were to come back tonight, He's going to render 16 billion judgments, right? Because every single person that's ever lived is going to stand before God to receive the things done in His body. Everybody's going to stand before God in the day of judgment. Think, man, that'd be a long time to wait, but time won't matter after that. You know, when the earth is gone and everything's been burned up, there ain't no such thing as time. And I'll tell you this, if you were the last one in line, it'll still seem like you had to stand before God first. But God's going to render 16 billion judgments. And whatever verdict He renders is going to be right. And any extenuating circumstances that might surround a case is going to be right. And then the sentence that God gives is going to be right. Now, you can have the best, most well-intentioned judge, but he's not always going to get it right. Sometimes he may convict the guilty and acquit the innocent. Same goes for juries, right? They can acquit the guilty and convict the innocent. Judges can give too harsh of a penalty for somebody, or too little. What judge is there that sat on a bench and said, you know what, I got every single sentencing right, and all the years I was on the bench, I didn't miss any of them? Or do you reckon he might have said, you know what, I was too hard on that guy? Or, I should have given that guy about 10 more years than I did. Well, guess who's never going to make that mistake? God. You know, God's not going to let somebody into heaven that I think doesn't deserve to go there, and I'm not going to jump up and say, Your Honor, I object. You know, or God's not going to condemn somebody to hell that I think ought to go there, and I'm not going to jump up and say, Your Honor, I object. Why? Because whatever God says is right. Whatever He says is right. And so God's always going to overcome. No matter what kind of trial you put God on, He's going to come out on top. And it's not because He's stronger than you. It's not like if me and Zach got in a fight that Zach's always going to come out on top because he's younger, bigger, and stronger than me. All right? You know, He's always going to come out on top. But God's not going to come out on top for that reason. God's going to come out on top because He's right. He's right. All right? So then we get to chapter 3 and verse 5, which gets us down here to question number 4. Now Paul's doing another end around on a question that the Jew might say, or potential situation. He says, now look, when he says, but if our, he's not talking about himself. He's talking about his invisible detractor. Okay? He's speaking, in other words, I don't want to call him a straw man because he's not a straw man, but in other words, it's an invisible Jew that Paul has set up, and knowing the Jews as well as he does, he knows what the Jews are going to say in response. All right, you know, because he is one or was one. So Paul says, here's what the Jews are going to say. Well, if our what? Question 4. Unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God what? Unjust, who inflicts wrath? I speak as a man, certainly not. For how then will God judge the world? So the question is from the Jew, well, if my wrongdoing, my unrighteousness is a way for God to show His righteousness, then I shouldn't be judged because what I did showed the righteousness of God. Now, hold your finger there in Romans 3 and turn your Bible over to Romans chapter 6, verse 1. And for the sake of time, I wish I had time to run back into the end of chapter 5 to introduce this, but what we have is the exact same argument being made. Paul is saying, where sin abounded, grace did what? Much more abound. In other words, it doesn't matter how big a sinner you were, God's got enough grace to cover it. Right? Is that true or not true? It's true. Whether you're new to the sinning game or you've been in it a long, long time, God's got enough grace to cover your sin. But then he says, so if that's true then, if the more sin there is, the more grace there is, well, I'll just keep on sinning so I can get more grace. So what does he say in verse 1? What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. You see, Paul is, and so when we get back here in this verse 5, it's the same thing. And I gave you Romans 6:1 so you can understand exactly what's being said here in verse 5. They're asking the question, why would I even be judged? If my sin causes good things to happen, then God shouldn't punish me for that. And then Paul answers, says, wait a minute. He says, no. He said, if that was true, then God couldn't judge anybody. Because the truth of the matter is, everyone's sin gives space for God to show His righteousness. All right, let me say that again. Everyone's sin gives space for God to show His righteousness because everyone sins. Thus, God can show His righteousness to everyone insofar as He has determined to save everyone. And by determined, I mean He's done everything He can. So it doesn't. The sin matter is not an obstacle that cannot be overcome by God. But at the same time, it's not something that we should be proud of just because we're the recipients of more grace, if it be the case that we have committed more sin. All right, and so the note there is, the Jewish end around. Shouldn't I be given a pass since my sin brings God glory? The apostle says if men are given a pass because of their sin, nobody can be judged. Now the next page, top of page 2. I know this is a long one, but it's verses 7 and 8. It's question 5. For if the truth of God has increased through my lie to His glory, why am I also still judged as a sinner? Now this is Paul going back as the invisible Jew again. The invisible Jew says, well, if God's truth is increased because of my lies, and that glorifies God that His truth is increased, then why would you even call me a sinner if what I'm doing helps show God's glory? And then it says, and why not say, let us do evil that good may come, as we are slanderously reported, and as some affirm that we say, their condemnation is just. So Paul dealing again with his invisible Jewish counterpart. Well, if the truth of God increases through my lie to His glory, why would God call me a sinner? Because all my sins are bringing God glory. And then Paul says, and why not say, let us do evil that good may come? And he says, and some are actually saying that I'm teaching that. You see how he switches over? He says, we are slanderously it is slanderously being reported that we are teaching, let us do evil that good may come. In other words, they had taken the teaching of Paul on the matter of grace, twisted it around, and tried to make Paul to be saying, we need to do more evil so that we can get more grace. And Paul said that is a slanderous. What does slander mean? It's a false accusation. It's a lie. It's a false representation. Paul says we are being falsely represented by people who say we want people to commit sin that good may come, which, by the way, is a pretty important thing for us to think about, especially in the context of today's society. Because our society says the ends justifies the means. In other words, it doesn't matter what I do as long as a good result comes out of it. And Paul said, that's slanderous. That's slanderous. It's never right to do wrong. Even if you think good comes out of it, it's never right to do wrong. And so Paul teaches us that there is no such. And by the way, this is what you would hear referred to in our day and time as situation ethics. Situation ethics. In other words, what is right and wrong depends on that's the ethic. What is right and wrong depends on the situation. And Paul said that's not true. Wrong is always wrong no matter what the situation is. And right is always right no matter what the situation is. Paul says teaching situation ethics is slanderous. It's slanderous. It's an affront to God. It's an affront to God. You know, God. Now look, I'm not saying. Now let me step back here just a second. I'm not saying that the Bible doesn't show us examples of people being blessed after they did bad things, because those things happen. But just because the Bible reports those things as happening does not mean that God approved of them. I mean, Jacob and his mama, lied to Jacob's daddy, right? They deceived him. He said, I'm Esau. All right? That wasn't right. At the same time, it wasn't right for Esau to try to claim his birthright because he'd sold it to his brother years ago. In other words, the Bible records these things as happening. But to record that they happened, and also to record that these people ended up being tools of the Lord to bring about good, doesn't mean that God approved the bad things that they did. All right, and so we want to be careful that just because people did wrong in the for example in the Old Testament in particular, just because people did wrong in the Old Testament and ended up being blessed because of it, doesn't mean that God approved of the means. It's just simply a record. It's just simply a record of those things happening, and so I thought it was important to mention that, because I've heard people say, people, Abraham lied about who Sarah was, and this and that, and Abraham's the father of faith, and God blessed Abraham, and like I said, Jacob lied, and it's just one, they can just give you one thing after another where people sin. It's like, wait a minute, the question is not did they do these things, the question is you have to show me that God approved of those things being done, and that cannot be done. That's exactly right, John.
Because look, if everybody did right, and this is me, but I'm saying, if everybody tried their best to do right, it would give occasion for God to bless us more.
Yeah.
You see?
Right. If you'd done right from the start, your blessing might have come earlier.
Yeah. Very possible that it would have.
Right. Yeah, because and that'd be an impossible thing to deny. Because you can't deny.
If you do good,
That's right.
we just talked about it.
That's right. If you do good, He'll bless you. That's exactly right. All right.
He would. And if you did all right and didn't get anything, you're justified. You can look at it that way too.
Say it again.
I said if you did right all of your life and no one noticed it, doesn't matter.
That's right.
You're justified.
That's right. You're still doing right. Yeah,
Right.
it doesn't matter if people see it or recognize it or praise you for it.
Yeah. It's not you and them, it's you and Him.
It's right. It's not you and them. It's you and Him. That's exactly right. All right. Let's look at question 6, and then we'll stop. And pretty much, I've already mentioned everything that's in the notes under number 5. And I want to get to question 6 because it's a good stopping point, because question 7 begins a completely different section of the text in chapter 3. So question 6, Paul says, "What then? Are we better than they? Not at all. For we have previously charged both Jew and Gentiles or Greeks that they are all," what? They are all under sin. Now, something from Cottrell here that I found particularly interesting says, Cottrell notes the difficulty of the rendering here, "Are we better than they?" Some manuscripts have the verb in the passive voice, meaning, well, then have we been surpassed by them? Now, remember, the Jew thing goes all the way back to chapter 3, verse 1. What was the point in being a Jew if we're all in the same boat? So then Paul starts dealing with all these so-called arguments, these theoretical arguments, anticipating these arguments, and thus it could be that the Jew might think, well, maybe they're better off than us after all. Maybe they're better off than us. But it doesn't matter which way you interpret it. If the Jew asks, well, are we better than they? Or if they are asking, well, are they better than us? The answer is still the same, isn't it? I mean, look at the verse. Not at all. Are we better off than the Gentiles? Not at all. Are we worse off than the Gentiles? Not at all. So it doesn't matter. The interesting thing to me is it doesn't matter how you look at the question, are we better than they as that, or have they surpassed us? We're worse than them. The answer is still the same. Not at all. For we have concluded that both Jew and Greek are all under sin. So just an interesting kind of little detail there. So, but looking at it, if you looked at it from the standpoint of, well, are they better than us? And Paul says not at all. I would look at it this way, and this is how I'll close out. From the beginning of chapter 2, Paul has just been hammering the Jews. I mean, we'd say it in this, man, he's just been killing them. I mean, it's just blast after blast after blast after blast. And then you get down here to chapter 3 and he's still blast. And it seems like Paul in this statement that it might make sense that the Jew might ask, well, then are they better than us? You've been beating us down for the last 45 verses. So are you saying they're better than us? Not at all. And I think of it kind of like this. You think about, I'll use a teaching analogy, okay? And I know Sam will be able to, and by the way, and you can use a sports analogy too, and you'll see how this works out. All right, let's say Jen here's my student. All right, I'm a teacher and Jennifer's my student. And she's a good student. She's a studious student. She's got her homework done. It's generally done it's done the right way. She doesn't have any, I don't have any problems with her in class, but in this particular week, Jen's had a bad week. Her homework wasn't done on Monday. It wasn't done right on Tuesday. She misbehaved in class on Wednesday. And then she did something else. She did something else on Thursday. And I haven't had to get on to Jennifer all week, all year. But this week I got on her Monday, I got on her Tuesday, I got on her Wednesday, I got on her Thursday. And it might be that Jen's like, you know what, man, what's the point? He crawled my case Monday, he crawled it Tuesday, he crawled it Wednesday, he crawled it. What's the point? Can I not do anything right? So what am I going to do if I'm a good teacher? What am I going to do? What am I going to do on Friday? I'm going to do something to make Jennifer feel built up, right? If she comes in on Friday and she's done the same thing that she's been doing for the whole year, I might be a little overly profuse in my praise, right? It's not that she's done anything outstanding on Friday, but I'm going to reel her. Before she gets too far away from me, and I don't mean this in a negative way, I'm going to reel her back in. I'm not going to let her take an emotional state of being rejected and having a bad week and let it ruin the whole year. I'm going to reel her back in on Friday. And then she's going to have a good weekend. Because everything I said about her or to her on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday is going to get forgot if I praise her on Friday. Then she's going to have a good weekend. She's going to come back in on Monday. She's going to be the old Jen again. All right? Same thing goes with a baseball or a football coach or whatever, a basketball coach. Some kid messes up an inbounds play. You're in practice and the kid runs the wrong way and the coach eats him alive. He dribbles a ball off his foot when he's not even supposed to be dribbling. Coach eats him up. And so the coach is just wearing this kid out in practice. I mean, he's just wearing him out. But the moment that kid makes a really good pass or a shot, or take in basketball, he takes a charge. I mean, that's the ultimate in basketball, man. When you take a charge, that's about as good as scoring. All right. So he takes a charge. What's the coach going to do? He's going to pour it on. He's going to pour it on and he's going to praise him. He's going to say, that's what I've been wanting you to do this whole practice. That right there. Right? So he's reeling him. Before he gets too discouraged, he reels him back in. Okay? It's almost like here in chapter 3, in these first 8 or so verses, Paul's trying to reel the Jews back in. Because they ain't been accustomed to getting blasted the way Paul just put it on them in chapter 2. So it might be easy for them to become overly discouraged. So Paul's reeling them in. And what he's saying is, look, you're not any worse off. You're not any better off, but you're not any worse off. And then that's where we get to verse 9 and all the Old Testament quotations. All right? So that's what we're going to pick up in. We're going to pick up in question 7, which is verse 10. That'll be the 8th. All right, the 8th. Now look, question number 8 requires a little work on your part, because there's a litany in verses 10 through 18. There is a litany of Old Testament quotations, and your job in question 8, A through G, is to find the Old Testament quotation that Paul is citing in this text. Which is why I always tell you, when you buy a Bible, buy one with references in it. Because all the answers to question 8, if you've got a good Bible, all the answers to question 8 are right there. So it's about learning how to use your Bible and learning how the Old Testament is drawn in to the New Testament. Okay? So be sure to do your homework there in question 8. This is one of those questions where the answer is not directly in the text staring you in the eye. You got to do a little digging, got to do a little work. All right?